Hand it over. All of it. The rifle was already leveled, and what happened next would cost those 4 men everything. Because the quiet man trailing that stage a day behind was the most feared gunslinger New Mexico Territory had ever produced, and he had ridden 300 miles to make sure his sister got where she was going. Her name was Clara Holt. Autumn of 1883, Mesilla Valley, New Mexico Territory. She was 26 years old, and the last 6 weeks had taken 10 years off her. Her husband, Thomas Holt, had died of a fever in Santa Fe, and now she was riding the Southern Mail stage south through the desert scrub toward Las Cruces, carrying a battered leather satchel, the watch Thomas had worn on their wedding day, and a brass key small enough to hide inside a fist. That key opened the Holt family strongbox at the Mesilla National Bank, which held the deed to 800 acres of bottomland along the Rio Grande. Bottomland worth roughly $12,000 to the right buyer, or the wrong one. Before we go any further into that October afternoon, friend, do yourself a kindness and hit that subscribe button. It keeps these old fires going, and it means the next time a story like this one comes along, it finds its way to you first. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I always like to think about who's on the other end of these old tales. Now let us get back to the Mesilla Valley, and to the 4 men who stopped that stagecoach. Clara had not slept well in a month. She sat by the coach window with her hands folded in her lap and watched the desert scroll past, the creosote and the yucca and the ochre mesas going flat under the afternoon sun. There were 3 other passengers, a dry goods drummer from Albuquerque who talked too much, a young school teacher from Tucson who slept with her chin on her shoulder, and a retired dentist with a chronic cough who smelled of camphor and kept his hat pulled low. None of them knew what Clara carried. None of them could have guessed the shape the next 2 hours would take. They came out of a dry wash at the foot of the Organ Mountains, 4 riders in canvas dusters with bandanas pulled up over their noses, and rifles already out of their scabbards. The lead man fired a shot into the air, and the driver, a 50-year-old veteran of the Butterfield line named Pete Garza, hauled back on the reins with the practiced calm of a man who had been through this before. He did not reach for his shotgun. The odds against it were too steep, and he knew it. The 4 riders spread out around the halted coach with the ease of men who had rehearsed this particular act more than once. Their leader rode up alongside the driver's box. He was thick in the shoulders with pale eyes that caught the sun and gave nothing back. His name was Deke Sutter, and in the 3 years since he had drifted down out of Colorado, he had built a reputation that stretched from Socorro to the border. Stage holdups, a post office robbery in Deming, a man shot in a card game in Lordsburg, under circumstances that the coroner diplomatically called unclear. He was not particularly clever, but he was disciplined enough to follow instructions, and someone had been feeding him very specific instructions. Step down, Pete. You know the routine. Sutter kept the bandana tight against his jaw, and Pete Garza climbed down from the box without argument. 22 years on the Southern Mail route had taught the driver which odds to fight and which ones to accept. Now, a word about the other 3 men, because they are not just bandits on horses, and they deserve to be understood for what they were. Crow was the lean one, always in a dark coat, angular in his movements the way a carrion bird is angular. All angles and no waist. He had done 2 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe for assault. Been released 6 months early on account of good behavior that was mostly just a talent for not getting caught at the things he continued to do. He was the one who handled the coach doors and the passengers, because he was good at reading people quickly, at knowing which passenger would flinch, and which one would hold still, and which one was likely to be hiding something worth taking. Burl was the squat one, quiet in a way that men mistake for slow, until they are wrong about it too late. He had ridden with Sutter since Colorado, through 2 other holdups and the post office job in Deming, and his value was not speed or calculation but physical certainty. When Burl had his gun out, men believed he would use it. He had that quality. Some men project hesitation no matter how mean they actually are. Burl projected none. Finn was the youngest blonde and still soft around the jaw. He had drifted into Sutter's orbit in Socorro after losing his last job driving cattle, and he was in that particular stage of a young man's bad decisions where the next choice has not yet arrived to prove to him that the current one is a mistake. The three riders moved to the coach doors. Crow yanked open the passenger door and stepped back. "Everybody out, hands where I can see them." The drummer climbed out first, already sputtering apologies nobody wanted. The dentist came after him, slow and stiff. The school teacher stepped out, gripping her carpet bag. Clara came last. Crow looked at her for a long moment. He was the sort of man who calculated very quickly where the money was, and a widow in good traveling clothes on the southbound Mesilla line was worth calculating. He gestured with his rifle toward the leather satchel she had over her shoulder. That bag. Clara tightened her hand on the strap. It was an instinct, not a decision, and it told Crow exactly what he needed to know. He reached out and took the satchel by the bottom, and when she did not release it, he simply pulled harder, using his weight against hers, until the strap slid off her shoulder. Sutter walked his horse around the front of the coach and looked down at the passengers lined up in the dust. He looked at Clara, then at the satchel in Crow's hand, then back at Clara. He had been told to look for a widow with a particular piece of luggage, and the description matched well enough. He leaned forward over the saddle horn. "Hand it over. All of it." His voice was completely level, the way a man's voice gets when the threat is so established that raising it would be a waste of effort. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were red from road dust and from weeks of grief, but they were steady. "My husband's watch is in there." "I'm not interested in the watch." "Then I'll take the watch and you can have the rest." She reached into the satchel, found the watch by feel, and closed her fingers around it. Something in the set of her jaw made Crow glance sideways at Sutter. A half-second of communication that passed between men who had ridden together long enough to skip the words. Sutter shook his head the smallest amount. Clara saw it. She had not let herself cry since the morning they loaded Thomas onto a buckboard in Santa Fe. She was not going to cry now in front of four men with rifles. She surrendered the bag. Crow handed it to the fourth rider, a blond boy of maybe 20 who everyone called Finn, young enough that his hand still shook when things got tense. Finn held the satchel across his saddle and waited. Sutter swung down from his horse. He was tall enough that when he walked up to Clara, she had to look up at him, and he used the height deliberately, stepping into her space the way men do when they want a woman to feel the difference between her size and theirs. "The strongbox key," he said, low enough that the other passengers could not quite hear. "We know you're carrying it. My business partner in Mesilla told me about the deed, the strongbox, the woman carrying the key south on the Tuesday stage. He gave me very specific information, Mrs. Holt. So before you tell me you don't have a key, understand that I already know you do." Clara looked at him steadily. The watch was clenched in her right hand inside her coat pocket, and the key was in her left boot, and she did not move. "I want to know who told you that," she said. It was the wrong thing to say, because it confirmed the key existed, and Sutter saw the confirmation cross her face the instant she understood her mistake. He reached out and took her arm at the elbow. Not violently, but with a grip that meant she was not going anywhere until he decided she was. "Now, I want you to hold that picture in your mind for a moment. A woman in October desert dust, her arm held by a man with pale eyes and no good intentions. 4 armed men around a stopped coach 100 yards from the Oregon mountains. The afternoon light going the color of old copper. Hold it, because the thing that changed all of it was already in motion. A day's ride north on the Mesilla Road, moving at a steady trot that ate the miles without drama. A man named Eli Calloway had been following that stagecoach since Santa Fe. He rode a dark bay horse and wore a sun-bleached duster, and his hat was low enough to make his face mostly shadow. Most men who saw Eli Calloway on the road noticed the horse first, because it was a fine animal, and then they noticed the way the man sat the saddle, which was the posture of someone who had ridden very long distances for a very long time, and who was in no particular hurry because he knew with absolute certainty where he was going. If they then noticed the rig on his hip, they generally found somewhere else to look. Eli Calloway was Clara's older brother by 9 years. He was 35 years old that October, and the territory had put most of those years into his face the hard way. He had ridden for the Marshal's service out of Albuquerque for 4 years in the late 70s, the years when the Lincoln County troubles were bleeding over everywhere, and every county in the territory had 3 or 4 men who needed collecting. He had collected them with a patience and precision that made other marshals uneasy, because Eli did not bluster, and he did not rush, and he very rarely missed. After the marshal service, he had drifted through a few years that he did not talk about much, and the territory had filled in the gap with stories, the way the territory always does when facts are scarce. Some of those stories were true, and some were embellished, and a few were entirely invented, but the net result was a name that traveled faster than the man himself, which was saying something, given how fast the man could move when he had reason to. He had gotten the letter from Clara 3 weeks before she took the stage south, explaining about Thomas dying and the deed and the trip to Mesilla to settle the estate. He had written back saying he would ride down to meet her. Clara had written back saying she did not need an escort. She was 26 years old and had ridden the southern mail stage before. Eli had considered that argument for exactly 1 day, and then saddled his horse anyway and ridden for Santa Fe, arriving 4 hours after the stage had already left. He spent the hours since making up the distance, at the same steady trot, watching the road. He had not told Clara he was coming. She would have argued harder. Now let me tell you about the man who had given Deke Sutter his very specific information, because the story does not make complete sense without him. His name was Gorman Price. He held the title Agent for the Southern New Mexico Stage Line, Mesilla office, and he had held it for 6 years, long enough to know the schedules, the regular passengers, the cargo manifests, the accounts, the habits of the drivers, and the routing of the mail pouches. He was also $1,700 in debt to a man named Aldous Farrow, who had a law office on the plaza in Mesilla, and who bought land quietly and sold it loudly, and who had been watching the Holt bottomland for 2 years because the Southern Pacific Extension would run within a quarter mile of it, and the man who held that land during construction would make more money than most people in. The territory saw in a decade. Price had given Farrow the information. Farrow had arranged the riders through an intermediary, so there was no direct line between a respectable Mesilla land agent and 4 men with bandanas, and the plan looked clean and simple from the outside. Stop the stage, take the satchel and the key, access the strong box before Clara Holt could get a lawyer involved. No deed, no proof of ownership, no legal standing. A woman alone in a land dispute without documents was an easy thing to discourage. It was a well-made plan. It accounted for nearly everything. The one thing it had not accounted for was a man on a dark bay horse, a day's ride north, with 9 years of experience finding men who thought they had hidden their tracks well. Back at the stagecoach, Sutter tightened his grip on Clara's arm. A voice came from the direction of Pete Garza. Let go of her arm. But it wasn't Pete who spoke. He was standing with his hands visible, staring at something in the middle distance. Everyone turned. A rider had come out of the scrub at the edge of the wash. He was maybe 40 yards out, walking his horse at a slow walk, and he had not drawn his weapon, which somehow made it worse. He was just a man on a horse coming toward them at a calm pace, as if 4 armed riders and a stopped stagecoach were a thing he encountered every other Tuesday. Crow swung his rifle around. Finn's hand went to his holster. The third rider, a squat man named Burl, positioned himself between the newcomer and the satchel on Finn's saddle. Sutter did not release Clara's arm. He looked at the approaching rider and felt the first small thread of unease pull through him, because the man had not stopped, had not raised his hands, had not slowed down, and that was not how frightened men behaved. "That's far enough," Crow called out. The rider kept coming. At 30 yards, he walked the horse to the right a few degrees, so that his right side was turned slightly away from the group, which meant his right hand was further from view, which meant nothing good. I said, "That's far enough." Eli Calloway stopped his horse at 20 yards. He looked at the scene with the unhurried attention of a man reading a notice posted on a wall. Clara standing with her arm held, 4 riders, 2 with rifles out, the satchel on the blond boy's saddle, the driver standing off to the side, 3 passengers backed against the coach. Let go of the woman. His voice carried in the dry air without effort. Not a loud voice, the kind that does not need to be loud because it has never once said something it did not mean. Sutter's pale eyes moved from the rider to Clara, and then back. He was calculating. 1 man, 1 sidearm visible, no rifle in sight, 4 armed men, 2 with long guns out. The numbers were favorable, and he had run numbers like these before. "This doesn't concern you, mister." "Ride on." Eli did not ride on. "That woman is my sister," he said. "Let go of her arm and give back her bag, and ride out of this draw before the arithmetic goes badly for you." Crow laughed, a short, hard sound. "Your sister." "That's sweet." Burl muttered something. Finn shifted the satchel on his saddle like it had become uncomfortable to hold. Sutter let go of Clara's arm. He did it slowly, with deliberate care, then took 2 steps sideways so he was clear of the line between Clara and the rider. His hand went to his holster. 3 seconds to decide whether your family reunion is worth dying for. Clara stepped sideways and slightly back out of the way, because she knew her brother, and she knew what was about to happen, and she did not want to be standing in the middle of it. What happened next took about 4 seconds. Crow raised his rifle first, which was a mistake because it committed him before he had sighted properly. Eli's hand moved, and the Colt cleared leather and the shot caught the rifle stock, wrenching it sideways hard enough to tear it out of Crow's grip. Crow sat there for half a second staring at his empty hands. Burl went for his gun. He was fast. He cleared leather before the echo of the first shot had traveled back from the mesa. The second shot from Eli caught the dirt in front of Burl's horse's hooves, and the horse shied hard enough to throw Burl sideways in the saddle. He grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, and by the time he straightened up, his gun was on the ground. Sutter had his weapon out. He and Eli were looking at each other across 20 yards of desert air. Finn had not moved. He sat holding the satchel with both hands, which was probably the smartest thing Finn had done all day. The driver and the 3 passengers were not breathing. "You shoot my horse," Eli said quietly, as a man remarking on the weather. "I'm going to collect myself from the ground, and when I do, this conversation gets a different shape than what you see in front of you now." Sutter stared at him. "My name is Eli Calloway." The same quiet way. "No boast in it. Before you make a decision you can't take back, you should know that name." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Pete Garza, who had spent 22 years in New Mexico territory and had heard most of the names worth knowing, went very still in a different way than before. The name Eli Calloway had come up around enough campfires and in enough saloon conversations that it occupied its own particular weight in a man's memory. Not a legend, not a dime novel invention, something more uncomfortable, a documented fact. Sutter's gun hand was still up, but something in his face had shifted. He was working through his options and not liking any of them. "You're going to give back the bag," Eli said. "You're going to give back everything in it. And you're going to tell me who set this up, because you didn't find this stagecoach or my sister by accident, and I want the name of the man who gave you her schedule." Crow had dismounted to retrieve his rifle from the dirt. He was on one knee and he stopped moving. Sutter held his position for another 3 seconds. Then he holstered his weapon. It was not surrender exactly. It was the decision of a man who has looked at his cards and decided that folding now costs less than playing it out. He nodded at Finn. Finn leaned over and handed the satchel to Clara, who took it without looking at him. Farrow. A pause. Gorman Price set it up and Aldous Farrow paid for it. The name landed in the desert air and went still. Clara looked at Eli. Price works for the stage line. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone filing a fact away for later. He does. Eli kept his Colt out but lowered it slightly. He looked at Sutter for a long moment, the way he used to look at men when he was with the Marshal's service, and he was deciding whether to take them in or let them go. Pick up your rifle. This was to Crow. All 4 of you ride north. Don't stop in Mesilla. Don't stop in Las Cruces. Don't stop until you're in Doña Ana County, and then keep going. Crow picked up his rifle. Burl found his gun in the dirt. Finn had already turned his horse north without being told. Sutter mounted without a word. He looked at Eli one more time, not with the anger of a man who has been beaten, but with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something that changes his plans considerably. Then they rode north, 4 canvas dusters disappearing into the scrub at a pace that was faster than a walk and slower than a gallop, the pace of men who want to be somewhere else without looking like they're running. Pete Garza let out a breath that sounded like it had been stored for several minutes. Eli dismounted. He walked over to Clara, who stood with the satchel held in both arms against her chest and the watch in her right hand. She looked at him for a long moment. I told you I didn't need an escort. You did. Eli agreed. She looked at the satchel and then at him. You were already behind me. I got your second letter. The one where you told me not to come. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She closed her eyes for a second and then opened them again. She was not going to cry in front of Pete Garza and 3 passengers either, but it was a closer thing than it had been with the 4 riders. She turned the situation over in her mind. Price has access to the manifests. He would have known what I was carrying and when. He would. Aldous Farrow. She said the name like she was examining it for cracks. Thomas mentioned him. He tried to buy the bottom land twice, and Thomas turned him down both times. Eli put his Colt back in the holster. He looked south toward the Oregon Mountains where the afternoon light was going orange along the ridgeline. Pete Garza was already gathering reins to remount the box. 2 hours. By stage. More by horse. Eli looked at his horse, then at the stagecoach, then at Clara. I'll ride with the stage. That night they put up at the relay station at La Mesa, 12 miles north of Mesilla, a low adobe compound with a water trough and a pole corral and a main room that smelled of old grease and pine smoke. The stage line kept a remount station here. 4 fresh horses in the corral and a hostler named Refugio, who was 70 years old and had worked this station since it was a Butterfield stop, and who asked no questions about anything, ever. The drummer and the dentist and the schoolteacher took the 3 bunks in the back room. Pete Garza slept in the barn with the horses, which was his preference. Clara and Eli sat at the table in the main room after Refugio had banked the fire and gone to his cot, and Eli poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat with the cups between their hands and talked. Clara told him about Thomas dying. She told it the way she had not been able to tell anyone else, without the social performances of grief that the Santa Fe doctor and the landlady and the various clerks and officials had required of her. She told it plain, and Eli listened without trying to fix any of it, which was what she needed. She showed him the watch and the key. The key was small and brass, notched on one side a standard bank strongbox key that looked like nothing in particular if you didn't know what lock it opened. Eli turned the key over in his fingers. $12,000 of land. More if the southern extension comes through. Thomas knew it was coming. He bought the parcel 3 years ago because of it. Farrow knew it too. Clara said so, and Eli had already worked that out from the moment Sutter mentioned the man's name. The stage approach had failed. That would not be the end of it. The bottomland was too valuable, and Farrow had invested too much in the arrangement to simply accept a setback and move on. He has the stage line connection, Eli said. Price can tell him everything that moves on the Mesilla Road. We can't go straight to the bank in the morning. Clara looked at the key, because Farrow will be watching the bank. Because Farrow has 2 days to arrange something else before you can file the deed with the county recorder, and the bank is the obvious place. He set the key on the table between them. She picked up the key and held it. Eli looked at the fire for a while before he went on. The sheriff in Mesilla is a man named Tatum. I know him from the marshal's years. He's not a bad man, but he's cautious, and Farrow is a lawyer with courthouse connections, and Tatum knows which battles cost what. He'll want evidence before he moves. Sutter named Farrow. He named him in front of Pete Garza and 3 passengers. Sutter named Farrow to 4 witnesses on a stage road and then rode away. That's not going to be enough for Tatum to move on a respected member of the Mesilla bar without something more solid. Eli set his coffee cup down. We need Price. The night sounds of the desert came through the thick adobe walls, distant and muffled, the creak of the corral, the horses shifting, the long dry silence of the desert itself pressing against the building from all sides. Price has an office in the stage line depot. He'll be there in the morning. Clara thought it through. And by morning, Sutter will be far enough north that Farrow won't be able to reach him quickly. Farrow's going to be very eager to find out what happened on the road today. Price will know. Price is going to be nervous, and a nervous man with bad debts is easier to reason with, especially when the alternative is a federal charge for conspiracy to rob a mail stage. They sat with the fire for a while longer. Outside, the desert wind moved through the creosote, and the stars were the thick white scatter of a night sky with no moon. Clara asked him about the years he didn't talk about. He told her some of it, in the way that men who carry heavy things sometimes share the weight sideways. Not all at once, just enough to explain the current situation without opening everything. He had left the marshal's service in the fall of 1880. Which was the same fall that a land speculator in Doña Ana County had hired a former deputy to run a family off their ranch near Tularosa, and the family had written to the marshal's office, and Eli had gone to look into it. He had found enough to bring a case against the speculator and the former deputy, and he had brought it. And then the case had been examined by a territorial judge who had received a courtesy gift from the speculator's lawyer the week before. And the case had come to nothing. The family lost the ranch anyway. Eli had ridden out of Tularosa at the end of that winter, and he had not ridden for the marshal's service again. The speculator's lawyer had been a younger Aldous Farrow, 2 years before he opened his office on the Mesilla Plaza. Eli had not known where Farrow ended up after that. He knew now. Clara absorbed this without surprise. She had not grown up in New Mexico territory without understanding how the machinery worked or what it cost to get caught under it. Clara turned her cup. He'll try again. Even if we get to the bank, even if we file the deed. He might, but it's harder to move against a legal title holder who has a witness account, a named conspirator, and a brother who tends to show up at inconvenient moments. Clara looked at the key. I'm not selling the land, Eli. Thomas bought it for us. For the future he thought we were going to have. Eli did not say anything to that. He understood what the land meant. He had watched his sister bury the future it represented 3 weeks ago in a Santa Fe cemetery. Then we make sure nobody takes it from you, he said. They banked the fire around midnight. Eli took the main room floor with his saddle for a pillow, and he lay there in the dark listening to the desert sounds and thinking through the morning. Before first light he was up. He went out to the corral and checked his horse, and stood in the cold pre-dawn air looking south toward where the Mesilla Valley would come visible when the sun came up. The air smelled of dust and dried juniper, and somewhere far off the Rio Grande. Refugio came out to start the morning feed, and they stood together in the early dark without talking, which was the kind of company Eli preferred. When the light came up enough to see by, he went back inside and woke Clara with a knock on the doorframe. They ate a cold breakfast of Refugio's leftover biscuits and the last of the coffee, and then they talked through the morning. The stage would leave for Mesilla at 7. Clara would ride with the passengers. Eli would ride alongside but back, out of sight of the road. If Pharaoh has arranged something on the road, I want to see it before they see me. Clara tied the key into a small cloth pouch and hung it on a cord inside her dress, against her skin. The satchel she packed back as it had been, with Thomas's watch on top where she could reach it. The stage rolled out of La Mesa at 7:10 with 4 passengers, Pete Garza on the box, and a man on a dark bay horse riding at a distance behind and to the right, far enough back to see the road ahead of the stage, without being a visible part of its company. The 12 miles to Mesilla were quiet. The morning was cold and the desert grass still had the night's dew on it, and the Organ Mountains went from gray to pink to the brown of dried blood as the sun came up over them. No riders came out of any washes, no dust moved on any side road. Eli followed at a distance and watched and arrived in Mesilla 20 minutes behind the stage. He came into town by the back way, down an alley between a livery and a feed store, and left his horse at the livery with $1 and specific instructions about not discussing the horse with anyone who asked. Then he walked to the stage line depot on the main street. Clara was already there. She had separated from the other passengers at the depot door and was standing near the office window with her arms folded and a look on her face that Eli recognized from 30 years of watching his sister navigate situations she did not like. Gorman Price's office was a narrow room with a window onto the main street and a back door into the depot yard. Price was at his desk when they came in, a thin man in his 50s, with the worn-down look of someone carrying a weight they had been carrying too long. He looked at Clara and then at Eli, and the color went out of his face in the time it takes to recognize that your situation has changed. Clara set her satchel on his desk. The stage was stopped yesterday afternoon. 4 armed men. A man named Deke Sutter. Price looked at his desk. Eli pulled a chair from the wall and sat on it backward with his arms across the chair back, watching Price. We know you gave Sutter the information. We know Aldous Pharaoh is the man behind it. We know about the debt. Price looked up. I have a daughter in Tucson. The words came out flat, as though he had rehearsed them alone before he ever said them to anyone. It was not a denial. It was the first true thing he offered, and it fell into the room with the weight of a thing that had been carried a long distance. There are men who do wrong things for reasons that are not entirely without feeling, and Gorman Price was one of them. He was miserable about what he had done, and the misery was still fresh enough to be useful. There's a federal charge on the table, Eli said. Conspiracy to rob a U.S. mail stage. Federal court, not territorial court. Aldous Pharaoh's connections don't reach into federal court the same way they reach into the county courthouse. A pause. But a man who gives testimony against the organizer, who produces documentation of the payments received, who cooperates fully with both federal and territorial authorities, that man has something to bargain with. Price looked at Clara. I didn't want anyone hurt. My arm is bruised from the elbow to the wrist. Her voice was flat and exact, the kind of flat that costs more to maintain than anger does. Price closed his eyes. What do you need from me? What they needed was the ledger. He had kept one, a narrow leather account book in the bottom drawer of his desk, because men who do dishonest things for powerful people very often keep records as insurance, and Price was smarter than he had been given credit for. The ledger documented 3 payments from Pharaoh through an intermediary account. The most recent made 2 days before the Tuesday stage schedule was shared with Deke Sutter. It was not conclusive on its own, but combined with Sutter's statement naming Pharaoh and Price's testimony in the account records, it was the kind of evidence that made a cautious county sheriff decide the battle was worth fighting after all. Eli took the ledger and also took Price's written statement, dictated and signed in the office with Clara as witness. Price wrote it out in his careful accountant's hand. 3 pages, every detail he knew. While Price was writing, Eli went to the window and looked out at the main street. Mesilla in the morning was a quiet place, wagon traffic on the plaza, A few horses at the rail outside the cantina. A man in a dark suit stepping out of the courthouse across the square. The man stopped on the courthouse steps and looked at the stage line depot for a moment. A professional look. The look of someone inventorying what they see. Then he went back inside. Eli watched the courthouse door close. Pharaoh's already at the courthouse. Clara came to stand beside him. He'll be trying to file something before you can. A property claim, a lien, some kind of paper that creates a competing position for his lawyer to work with. They needed to move. The bank opened at 9. The county recorder opened at 9:30. The sequence mattered. Bank first to verify the key and confirm the deed contents. Recorder's office second to file. Sheriff third with the evidence against Pharaoh. Price finished his statement and signed it and handed it to Eli. He looked like a man who would put down a very heavy bag. What happens to me? A question he had probably been sitting with all night. Eli's answer was brief and exact. That depends on how useful your testimony is, and on whether there are any other people in Mesilla who Pharaoh has been using the same way. Price looked at his desk. 2 others, a clerk in the county recorder's office, and the deputy sheriff. Eli took that in without expression. Clara turned from the window. His name is Canfield, Price went on, needing to say it now that he had started. He won't move against you directly. He'll delay. He'll create paperwork. He'll find reasons why the filing can't be processed today. And the sheriff? Tatum doesn't know. Tatum is a straight man. Pharaoh has worked around him, not through him. Eli stood. Get your coat, he told Clara. Bank. Then Tatum. The Mesilla National Bank was a narrow 2-story building on the south side of the plaza, with iron bars on the window, and a manager named Everett Cross who had the careful manner of a man who lived in proximity to other people's money. Cross recognized Clara's name from the Holt account and took them to a back office, and Eli stood by the door while Cross and Clara confirmed the strong box contents. The deed was there. It was a clean title properly recorded in 1880. Thomas Holt and Clara Holt, the 800 acres of bottomland along the Rio Grande, drawn out in the careful survey script of the Territorial Land Office. Clara looked at her husband's name on the paper and held it for a moment, and Eli looked at the wall. She had the original deed in her hand when they walked out of the bank and directly across the plaza to the sheriff's office. Tatum was behind his desk. He was a square-built man in his 50s, with a short gray beard and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough urgency to have learned that most of it resolves itself if you wait. He looked at Eli when they came in with the recognition of a man whose memory for names and faces is professionally maintained. Calloway, he said. Tatum. It's been a while. Tatum looked at Clara and at the paper she was carrying. Sit down. They sat. Eli laid out the evidence on Tatum's desk in order. Price's statement, the ledger pages, the names of the 2 compromised men in Pharaoh's network, the stage robbery account from Eli's own direct observation. The deed in Clara's hand is documentary proof of what the robbery had been designed to take. Tatum read the Price statement twice. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the deed. He asked 4 questions, all of them about specific facts rather than impressions, and they answered them. Deputy Canfield. Tatum put the name on the desk between them, like he was testing the weight of it. That's what Price says. Tatum looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at Eli. I'll need your formal statement before I move on any of this. You'll have it. I'll send a man to the recorder's office to secure it against any irregular filings before we get the deed processed properly. Not Canfield. Not Canfield, Tatum agreed. He stood with the measured deliberateness of a man who had decided something and was going to see it through at his own pace. Give me 2 hours. Those 2 hours were the longest Clara Holt had spent since the morning in Santa Fe. She and Eli waited in the lobby of the stage line depot, which was the safest public location they could find on the Mesilla Plaza, where Clara was visible to the passing street, and Eli had a view of both doors and the window. The waiting was its own kind of work. Clara sat in the depot lobby and watched the morning traffic on the plaza, and thought about the parcel. The 800 acres along the Rio Grande that Thomas had spent 3 years acquiring piece by piece, negotiating with 4 different sellers, drawing up the consolidation agreements himself at the kitchen table in their Santa Fe rooms with a law book open beside him, because he did not trust the territory's land lawyers to do it right. She thought about the orchard he had drawn plans for, the variety of apple trees he had researched, the specific rootstock he had written to a nursery in Colorado about 2 weeks before the fever took him. She thought about all the ways a life accumulates plans that get left unfinished, and she thought about finishing them. At 11:30, a deputy came to tell them that Aldous Farrow had been brought to the sheriff's office for questioning. At noon, Tatum himself came to escort Clara to the county recorder's office, where the deed was filed in proper order under the direct eye of the sheriff, and with Deputy Canfield conspicuously absent from the premises. At 1 o'clock, a federal marshal's man arrived by telegraph from Las Cruces in response to the robbery complaint that Tatum had sent first thing. And by mid-afternoon, the stage robbery investigation had formally moved into federal jurisdiction, which had exactly the effect on Aldous Farrow's confidence that Eli had described to Price the night before. They found Farrow in his office on the plaza that afternoon. It was a well-appointed room with a view of the mountains, and shelves of law books and the air of a man who had always treated the law as a tool rather than a constraint. He looked at Tatum and the federal man, and then at Eli in the doorway, and he understood immediately that the shape of the day was not what he had intended it to be. He said very little. Men like Farrow know the moment when talking makes things worse. He looked at the ledger in Tatum's hand and made a calculation that took about 3 seconds. And then he asked for his hat, which was hanging on a peg by the window. Tatum handed him his hat. The federal man had the rest. It took 4 more days to settle the estate. There were papers to file and accounts to close, and a meeting with the Holt family solicitor in Las Cruces, who had not known about Farrow and was relieved and then angry and then professionally focused in the way lawyers get when they see the work that needs doing. By Friday of that week, Clara Holt's title to the 800 acres was filed, confirmed, and returned to its strongbox at the Mesilla National Bank under a new key that Gorman Price had no access to, as Price was by then preparing his formal cooperation with the federal investigation in exchange for the consideration his full testimony had purchased. Canfield resigned his deputy's commission before Tatum had to fire him. He left Mesilla that same Friday on the northbound stage. Nobody remarked on it. On Saturday morning, Eli saddled his horse in the livery yard. He had his gear packed as it had been when he arrived. The same worn saddlebags, the same bedroll. The horse was rested and moved well under the morning light. Clara came into the livery yard. "You could stay a while. The land needs work. Thomas had plans for a building on the north end, and I'd want someone who understood what needed doing to look at the survey with me." Eli buckled the saddlebag without answering right away. He checked the cinch and ran his hand along the horse's neck the way he always did when he was collecting his thoughts. He checked the cinch a second time, the thing he did when he was done deliberating. "You have a solicitor now, and a clear title and a sheriff who knows your name. You have what you need. I know what I have." She looked at him. "I also know you're not built for staying in one place." It was not a complaint. It was an observation from a woman who had spent 30 years watching the same man. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. Clara held Thomas's watch in her hand. She had taken it out of the satchel before the solicitor arrived and worn it on a chain since, the way you wear something that belongs to a person you are still having a conversation with in your mind. "He would have liked you, Thomas. He always said he wanted to meet you. I'm sorry I didn't make it sooner. You made it in time." She looked up at him. "That's the part that matters." Eli touched the brim of his hat. He turned the horse toward the livery gate in the morning light. He rode north on the Mesilla Road at the same steady trot he had ridden south on 4 days before, the dark bay horse moving smooth and quiet through the morning desert, past the creosote and the yucca, and the ochre mesas, past the wash, where 4 men in canvas dusters had stopped a stagecoach and started something they did not finish. The desert looked exactly as it had on Tuesday. Nothing in the landscape showed any sign of what had happened there. That is often the way of it out here, friend. The desert absorbs what happens in it, and goes on looking the same. The bones of men and the ruins of bad plans disappear under the same red dust, and in a year you could ride through that wash and find nothing to tell you that anything had ever changed hands there. But things had changed. The deed was filed. The title was clean. The bottomland along the Rio Grande had an owner who intended to stay, and the man who had arranged to take it from her was going to spend several uncomfortable months explaining himself to federal authorities who did not particularly care about his connections to the county courthouse. And on the northbound Mesilla Road, a man on a dark bay horse rode through the morning, and the territory opened up ahead of him, and the Oregon mountains went blue with distance behind him. Now, as for old Gorman Price, he gave his testimony, every word of it, in the federal proceeding that spring. And what he said about Aldous Farrow's other arrangements in Doña Ana County went considerably further than the stagecoach robbery. There were 6 other properties involved, 3 other men compromised by debt the same way Price had been. It was the kind of thing that collapses when one piece comes loose, and Price was the piece that came loose. Farrow's law practice closed by summer. He left New Mexico territory before the criminal proceeding reached its final stage, which was a common enough outcome in those years when the territory was still young enough that a man with resources could outrun the consequences of what he had done. At least for a while, at least to somewhere that did not yet know his name. Clara Holt built a house on the north end of the bottomland by the following spring, a good, solid adobe house with a proper foundation and a porch looking west over the river. She hired 2 men to work the land, and she planted the orchard Thomas had drawn up in his plans the winter before he died, the one he had not lived to see. The Southern Pacific extension came through 18 months later, as Thomas had calculated it would, and the bottomland was worth considerably more than $12,000 by the time she sat on that porch and watched the first train pass in the valley below. She never sold it. Now, friend, I have been sitting with this story for a while, and there is something in it that stays with me. Not the robbery, not the lawyering, not even Eli Calloway's particular economy with words and bullets. What stays with me is the moment in the relay station at La Mesa, late at night with the fire banked and 2 cups of cold coffee on the table. Eli told his sister some of the things he had done in the years he didn't talk about. Not all of them. There is a version of a man's life that he can tell, and a version that lives only inside him, and wisdom is knowing the difference between the two. He told her what she needed to hear to understand why he was still riding the territory roads at 35, with a bedroll and a saddlebag and no fixed address. She listened, without asking him to be a different kind of man than he was. That is the thing I keep coming back to. There are men built for settlement, for the house, and the porch, and the orchard, and there are men built to ride between, to show up when the trouble starts and be gone before the dust settles. The territory needed both kinds. The house needs the man who stays to build it, and the road needs the man who rides it, and neither one of them is wrong for what they are. Eli Calloway understood that protecting something does not require possessing it. He could ride 300 miles to make sure his sister got where she was going and then turn around and ride back without needing a stake in the outcome. That is a rarer kind of love than the kind that wants to stay and watch over what it cares for. But it is love all the same. Maybe more of it, for being harder to see. Clara Holt understood that about her brother, and she did not ask him to be otherwise. She just stood in the livery yard in the Mesilla morning light and watched him ride north, and then she went back to her solicitor and her deed and her plans for the orchard. And the watch stayed on its chain. The real lesson I carry from that stretch of New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1883 is a simple one. Most of the schemes that bad men build are not as strong as they look from the outside. Aldous Farrow had courthouse connections and a debtor's network, and a hired rider named Sutter. and he had thought of most of the contingencies. He had been building this kind of arrangement for years, and he was good at it, and he knew it. But he had not thought of one thing. He had not thought that a woman who had just buried her husband might have a brother who worked on a different calendar than a stage line agent, who measured distance in days rather than miles, who was already on the road before anyone thought to look. A plan that accounts for everything except the loyalty of blood is a plan with a hole in it, no matter how well you've arranged the rest. Keep that in mind, partner, the next time something looks so well arranged that it cannot come undone. There is always something. Usually, it is the thing that nobody thought to put on the ledger. If this story gave you something worth carrying today, do me the kindness of a like and a subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. Leave a word in the comments. Where are you? What time is it? What brought you out here to ride along with the old man tonight? Those comments matter more than you might think. Until the next trail, keep your powder dry and your word good. Those are the two things the West taught us that still hold up, no matter what era you are living in. This is the old man, signing off from somewhere between the mountains and the river, where the light goes long in the afternoon and the desert remembers everything it has ever seen. Safe travels, friend. Safe travels.